that's the first problem with this objection, and it's a big one, is that the similarities just are over-exaggerated. The second problem with this objection is that the pagan myth objection takes Jesus and the Gospels out of context. It just rips them out of their first century Palestinian context. You have to consider when these Gospels were written and who they were written by. They were written in first century Jewish Palestine by serious devout Jews. Now, serious devout Jews were very sincere about following Yahweh, their God. These were serious, hardcore Jewish monotheists. They weren't open to just willy-nilly adopting pagan views and let's go worship that now. These guys were at least sincere in their Jewish faith and not prone to just without much thought, just making up a story from pagan myth and just bowing down and starting to worship that. That was just, that doesn't take seriously the context in which these Gospels are written and who they were written by. So you have to remember that these guys at least took their faith very seriously, and they're not just going to go worship some pagan god on a whim, you see. So that is another important thing to consider when we're talking about this objection.
Well, this is a massive straw man, as nobody claimed that they went off and worshipped a pagan deity on a whim, but rather through a complicated verbal and social transaction, parts of the surrounding cultural influence got internalized. Now, you can pretend that this isn't how people behave, at least not certainly the devout, and yet Christianity has internalized no end of practices post-canon. These are supposedly devout Christians. Why is this any different to devout Jews? I mean, are Jews just that more devout than Christians? The fact is, we also know this to be false, as when you look at the Old Testament, many of these stories there match local oral traditions, a few of which were also then written down. The most famous, of course, being the Babylonian account in the Epic of Gilgamesh, which contains a comparable flood legend written before the book of Genesis. The researchers at the TV show Bullshit claim to have managed to find a further 5 cultures locally who shared such a story. The fact is that, yes, the Jews were very open to local cultural influence, just as we are today. Even with the internet and archived information, people can be found to internalize some of the most peculiar beliefs, sometimes beliefs that appear to be contradictory to one another. But it's not just the Jews. Again, post-canon Christianity has also internalized various cultural aspects. The ideas typically go through a process of assimilation where they are internalized, sterilized, and then propagated. This can be done from local religions, such as with what the missionaries have done in Uganda and Nigeria. They've taken in the local claims about the powers of witch doctors, merged them with claims of demons, and then set out to utilize the fear propagated to drive locals towards the churches. I mean, we're supposedly in a post-colonial era, and yet Western-funded churches are getting indigenous people killed by themselves. I mean, parents are even driving nails into their children's skulls to perform exorcisms. Thankfully, in the West, things are a little different. Media is a new cultural ground. Thus, things like rock music and film are internalized, sanitized, and propagated. In response to rock and metal, we got Christian rock. In response to 50 Shades of Grey, we got the equally awful story of old-fashioned. Even superheroes, which some cultural analysts argue are today's heroes of myth, are given this treatment, as seen with the movie series Bible Man. If this is true before and after the supposed time of Christ, then your second argument has no basis.
Now, the third problem with this objection, and maybe the most important one, I think they're all strong, but this is just one that I think is just devastating to the whole claim that the Gospels were myth, is that it's demonstrably false. It is false, and the reason why is because key details in the Gospels have been historically verified. And we'll talk more about this later as the course goes on, but for now we can just say that we can verify key important details in the Gospels using standard accepted historiographical methodology. So, for example, we know that the Gospels refer to real people like Caiaphas and John the Baptist, Pontius Pilate, and Jesus himself. They refer to real places like the Pool of Bethesda, for example, as mentioned in the Gospel of John. These events and people have been verified by other sources, archaeology, non-Christian testimony. You know, Josephus talks about John the Baptist and so on. So Josephus, by the way, was a non-Christian Jewish historian. So these kinds of people and places and things, they've been verified by other historical sources. Many events concerning the life of Jesus can be historically verified. The events that we see in the Gospels, such as the Last Supper, the death by crucifixion, and the discovery of Jesus' empty tomb. So, since so many details like this can be historically verified, and we'll talk more about that later on when it comes to a different objection, we get an idea of the kind of literature we are dealing with. What kind, and that's important. We call this the genre of the Gospels. What kind of literature is it? Are they trying to write myth? Is it apocalyptic? What kind of writing is it? Is it poetry? You see, these are literary genres. All the evidence suggests that the genre here is historical. And more particularly, it is biographical. They are trying to write a historical biography of Jesus. That's what the Gospels are trying to do. And we know that because of what they say, and because we can verify many of these historical details. So these works are the works of historical biography. That is the correct genre of the Gospel. So the myth objection just gets it all wrong. It gets it all wrong. That's just the wrong genre.
And when Jesus had cried out again in a loud voice, he gave up his spirit. At that moment, the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. The earth shook, the rocks split, and the tombs broke open. The bodies of many holy people who had died were raised to life. They came out of the tombs after Jesus' resurrection and went into the holy city and appeared to many people. Matthew chapter 27, verses 50 through 53. Many of the New Testament claims are not verifiable, such as the quoted example. An apparent follower of the prophet is worth mention, yet a supposed zombie uprising is not. No Jewish or Roman historian thought that the people rising from the dead was worth noting. Then there are the things which are plain falsifiable. Jesus was supposedly born during the reign of Herod the Great, as Matthew chapter 2 verse 1 claims. Yet according to Luke chapter 2 verse 2, Jesus was born during the first census of Israel, while Quirinius was governor of Syria. This is impossible because Herod died in March of 4 BC, and the census took place around 6 and 7 CE, about 10 years after Herod's death. So to pretend that the New Testament is historically accurate is a complete falsehood. This is in no way the reality of the matter. If you're going to set out to convince a skeptic, then you're going to have to do much better. Oh, and what's more is that the Last Supper, the crucifixion, and the empty tomb have never been verified to date.
You don't get all these verified key historical details from a myth, you see. it just doesn't happen. So anyway, these three reasons are show us, I think, with the strongest amount of historical confidence that this idea that the Jesus story just comes from pagan myth, this idea is just simply false, and I think we can show that to be the case.
This entire argument may widely be referred to as a Spider-Man fallacy. Now, the Spider-Man fallacy points to the fact that, much like the religious text, the Spider-Man comics is set in New York, with references to actual people and actual places. This then may be utilised to argue for the narrative of those comics in the same way that apologists do so for their religious texts. Yet this ignores that Mr. Sullivan is talking about specific events. Now, let's just accept the premise for starters, one which he never supported. Does that prove a lack of external influence or support the claims around the authenticity of the mystical events? No. My case in point, Godzilla 2014. One of the major plot lines of the film, the setup during the intro that is then elaborated upon later in the film, is that the Pacific Ocean nuclear testing was in fact conducted in attempts to kill Godzilla. Now, does the existence of these very specific events, as well as the historical existence of the soldiers, support that A, the claims which the Godzilla movie made were not influenced by post-war Japanese kaiju culture, and B, that Godzilla actually existed along with the rest of the science fiction claims? Now, Godzilla here is analogous to God, not Christ, as I need to be clear on that. A historic and albeit mundane Christ existing, I have no problem with, as it's rather probable, just like I have no problem with the United States being present in Bikini Atoll. That does not then validate the extraordinary claims as well as disprove external influence with later media representation of this event. The major difference is we know that the Godzilla films are fiction. That is, unless we were to apply the same reasoning you have throughout this video to Godzilla. And before you make another appeal to human common sense, there are Mormons who know the facts that Joseph Smith apparently failed the test to his claims, yet they still believe him. There are people who follow modern doomsday cults centered around people who claim themselves to be Christ, and there are people who believe that NASA is lying about the shape of the Earth. I don't have a lot of confidence in the common sense of humanity. That is why philosophy exists, and you of all people should appreciate that.